So we got this email from Paul the other day. And he says, I tell you what. Tim the lawyer joins us. Tim Standifer from Pacific Legal Foundation. Hey, Tim.
Hey.
Pacific Legal Foundation, what do you guys do? What the hell? What's your raison d'etre?
We're a nonprofit public legal foundation devoted to defending private property rights, economic liberty, and other individual freedoms in federal and state courts across the country.
A quaint notion. So that's right. So these guys spend all day, every day, trying to get more freedom. And Tim's fabulous book, The Right to Earn a Living, is terrific. Talks about all sorts of issues. But so now that you're on the line, let me go back to Paul's email. Very nice note, very well written, and very respectful, and we appreciate it. But he says, I'm a left-leaning moderate. I really enjoy your show every morning as I cruise down the freeway to my high-paying Silicon Valley job in my Pinko Kami Toyota Prius, sipping my $4 latte. I've generally found you guys are the least offensive thing. Blah, 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 and you're hilarious. Blah, 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 blah. But you said something this morning that made me think one of two things. Either you guys say things simply to be incendiary, or you really are right-wing wacko monkeys. You consistently claim day to day we're losing freedom in this country and that the government is encroaching on our liberties, oftentimes without our even knowing it. You used examples of the ice cream entrepreneur. Let me tell you one thing. We have regulations for a reason. It's to improve people's lives. Her not having a dairy license could result in her producing ice cream with spoiled milk and rotten eggs, et cetera, et cetera. By your logic, anyone who wants to start a business should be able to, free of government regulation. Want to start a lasagna stand from your basement and not be required to list the ingredients? Sure, go ahead, blah, blah, blah. And he thinks that's a nightmare scenario. And he says they have, sure, there are places where government does not force you to abide by such regulations. They have names like Afghanistan, Congo, Malawi, and Kazakhstan. So I thought we could talk about regulation, nanny laws, etc., that are everywhere and are almost entirely high-minded. They're good intentions there, Tim. How can you be against that sort of thing?
Well, I wouldn't say they're almost entirely high-minded, but certainly a lot of them are. And I think that the email makes a valid point, which is that government is in the business of protecting us against fraud or against being hurt by others and cheated or poisoned by others and stuff. So why shouldn't the government protect our safety? And I think at first that seems like a reasonable thing, but the problem is it hides an assumption, and the assumption is that if the government doesn't do it, nobody will. And that's not true. And the choice is not between government regulation and no regulation. The choice is between government regulation and private free market alternatives, because the market does regulate. The market regulates in a different way than government does. It regulates through consumer choice or competition or private regulatory organizations like the Good Housekeeping Seal of Approval or Consumer Reports or the ratings systems on Amazon.com and stuff. And you and I think we all know that most consumers rely on those. They don't rely on the government's regulatory system most of the time. If I'm going to choose to buy a product, I'm going to rely on word of mouth from my friends who have bought that product, not on whether the government says it's okay. So the question is not should government do this or should it be a free-for-all where everybody's killing each other in the streets. The question is, what reason do we have to believe that government can do a better job of protecting consumers than the free market?
Absolutely. And I know Milton Friedman was a big believer in private regulatory agencies. I don't know what you feel about those, but why can't a private organization regulate dairy products, for instance, and maybe all the dairy producers pay in a certain amount of money? Why is it any more likely or less likely to be corrupt than the government is or bad at it?
Exactly. In fact, Milton Friedman devoted a chapter of Free to Choose, his classic book, Free to Choose, on this subject, and I have drafted I put up a weblog post on the Pacific Legal Foundation's weblog just now that talks about these points in more depth and has the episode of the TV show Free to Choose where he talks about this. So any of your listeners who want a little bit more information can check out our weblog at timthelawyer.com. But the reason why private alternatives are probably better than government is because the incentives are different. If government messes up, they still get paid. Private businesses only get paid if they please the consumer. Private businesses can be sued if they do a bad job. Government can't be. When Enron defrauded all those people, Enron went out of business and a bunch of people went to jail. But nobody went to jail at the Securities and Exchange Commission, the government regulatory agency that's supposed to prevent things like Enron from happening, right? In fact, a lot of people think that if you don't like regulations, you can just vote the bums out or have some kind of democratic control, when in fact the vast majority of the laws under which you and me spend our lives are passed not by democratically elected officials, but by regulatory agencies that aren't elected.
Right.
In fact, you can't even fire them because they're government bureaucrats who are members of government unions. If they do a bad job, there's nothing you can do about it. You have no control. Whereas in a private market institution, if I go to a restaurant and they give me bad service or they serve me tainted food or whatever, I can shop somewhere else. I can choose not to give them my money. I can't choose not to pay a corrupt or bad regulatory agency.
Tim Sandifer of the Pacific Legal Foundation is online. We're talking about regulations in a very nice email written to us by Paul, who's a fan of regulation and keeping us all safe.
In the 50s...
I don't mean that sarcastically. He's a smart guy. Obviously.
In the 50s, I saw this on the news yesterday, there were 5,000 pages of regulations. There are now 70,000 pages of regulations.
Right.
Well, and you're just talking about the federal regulations.
Right.
There's also state regulations that are almost as heavy.
You know, there are a couple of things that are kind of ongoing themes around here. Number one, where the hell does your faith come from that the government's going to do this right? What have you observed that makes you think the government is some sort of paragon of efficiency and wisdom?
Better than a private organization.
I don't get you people.
I don't get it either.
And the second thing that, and feel free, Tim, in just a second, but the second thing is something we've discussed with you specifically, and that's that when government gets into the business of picking winners and losers, economically speaking, it is it is never entirely a pure-hearted, high-principled activity, and almost always becomes a system of bribes and graft and arm twisting or pocket lining. They don't do it well.
That's exactly right. And it's not, and that's important to keep in mind, it's not just that they have no incentive to do a good job because they get paid whether or not they do a good job out of taxation. It's also they have incentives to do a bad job because they are subject to lobbying pressures that don't exist in the private free market. So, for example, let's take this listener's example of food safety. On hot dog stands or other street vendors of food like taco trucks and things like that, they're regulated very heavily in most major cities. Here in Sacramento, for example, they're regulated very heavily. El Paso, Austin, Atlanta. And these cities impose regulations such as barriers, zones where they're not allowed to operate. They're subject to buffer zones so that they're not allowed to operate within a certain distance of existing restaurants. Now, if your concern is to protect the consumer against food poisoning, what difference does it make whether a food stand is located within a certain distance of a restaurant?
That's obviously not the goal.
None whatsoever.
Yeah.
The law exists to protect restaurants against fair competition.
Right, and they throw on the cloak of protecting you while they go about this nefarious stuff, and guys like Paul get fooled into thinking that their primary function, their primary goal is safety and a wonderful society. And, you know, maybe among some of them it is, but it almost never works out that way, and it's enormously expensive. Now, briefly, I see the emails coming because I've read them so damn many times. Oh, so you guys think the free market's going to result in some sort of perfect Valhalla of fairness and blah, blah, blah. Well, call me when your kid eats a tainted egg. No, I think it'll be full of screw-ups and temporary inefficiencies and problems, but they'll get solved 100 times more quickly than they do in an immense centralized bureaucracy. Where do I get that idea? From everything I've ever observed in my entire lifetime.
That's right. In a free market, I have a lot more ability to make my own decisions and protect myself than I do if the government runs regulations. And there's all sorts of downsides to regulations. The Food and Drug Administration kills thousands of people every year by withholding approval of crucial life-saving medication because they have no incentive to get that medication out on the shelf. But they have a huge incentive not to take any risks because they might get investigated by Congress or something like that. So they're a lot more risk-averse than they should be. And the problem, when we talk about the nanny state, we're not talking about my freedom to eat a hamburger or something. We're talking about government being so protective of us, so afraid to take risks, that it doesn't take the risks we need to take, and as a result, people suffer. There are real downsides to government regulation that don't necessarily exist if the consumer protects himself. You're right. Of course, a free market would not be a panacea. But when we talk about the free market, it's a phrase I like to say is we're not talking about utopia, but we are talking about the best of all possible worlds.
Right. And with all the imperfections, there would be 2.5% unemployment.
Government is not going to do a perfect job, and neither is the free market. But in the free market, I have a choice to go somewhere else and I don't have that choice when it comes to government. I can't fire it. I usually cannot sue it. I can't shop somewhere else. I have no power against the government, whereas certainly not against regulatory agencies that are not elected. But I do have that choice, that's power, when it comes to dealing with a private business.
Tim the lawyer, Tim Sandifer from the Pacific Legal Foundation. Hang on, Tim.